found a bear cub trapped in a ski lodge equipment room. What baby did next warmed winter. The old ski lodge sat nestled between two mountains like a forgotten secret, its wooden walls creaking softly under the weight of fresh snow that had been falling for 3 days straight. Lily Morgan pressed her small nose against the frosted window, watching the white world outside blur into nothing but endless swirls of snowflakes dancing in the wind. She was only 7 years old, but something about this particular evening felt different from all the others they had spent at the lodge since arriving 4 days ago. Her father, Ethan Marshall, sat by the fireplace, trying to read a book, but his eyes kept drifting to his daughter, noticing how she seemed unusually restless, moving from window to window as if searching for something she couldn't quite name. The lodge was empty, except for them and the caretaker who lived in a small cabin nearby, and the silence was so complete that even the crackling of the fire seemed loud in comparison. Lily had been hearing something for the past hour, a sound so faint that at first she thought it was just the wind playing tricks through the old wooden beams, but it kept coming back, rhythmic and persistent, like someone tapping out a message in a language she didn't understand. She didn't tell her father right away because she knew he would say it was just the building settling or maybe mice in the walls. But this sound was different. It had a pattern to it. 3 soft scratches, then a pause, then 3 more, over and over again. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere below them, maybe from the basement where all the old ski equipment was stored, a place her father had told her not to go because it was dark and full of sharp edges and heavy things that could fall. But children have a way of knowing when something needs their attention, and Lily felt pulled toward that sound like a magnet pulls iron filings. She walked over to her father, tugging gently on his sleeve, and when he looked down at her with those kind brown eyes that always made her feel safe, she whispered that she was hearing something strange downstairs. Ethan put down his book and listened, tilting his head slightly, but after a moment he shook his head and said he couldn't hear anything, though he could see in Lily's face that she was genuinely concerned about something. He stood up, stretching his tall frame, and decided that maybe checking it out would put her mind at ease so she could sleep better tonight. They walked together toward the narrow staircase that led down to the equipment room, Ethan carrying a flashlight because the overhead lights down there had stopped working years ago, according to the caretaker. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, and the temperature dropped noticeably as they descended, the warmth of the fireplace becoming just a memory. The basement was exactly as Ethan had described it, full of old skis leaning against the walls like tired soldiers, boots scattered across shelves, and poles bundled together with fraying rope. But there was something else, too, something that made both of them stop at the bottom of the stairs. The scratching sound was much clearer now, and it was definitely coming from behind a door at the far end of the room, a door that Ethan hadn't noticed before, because it was partially hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates. The door itself looked ancient, with iron hinges that had turned orange with rust, and a handle that seemed like it hadn't been turned in decades. Lily grabbed her father's hand tighter, not out of fear exactly, but out of that strange mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes when you're about to discover something important. Ethan approached the door slowly, his flashlight beam dancing across the worn wood, revealing scratches on the lower part of the door that looked fresh, as if something had been trying to get out. He put his ear against the door and heard not just scratching now, but also a soft whimpering sound, almost like crying, and his protective instincts immediately kicked in. Whatever was behind that door was alive and possibly hurt. He looked down at Lily and told her to stay back a little, just in case, but she shook her head and held his hand even tighter, somehow knowing that whatever was behind that door needed both of them. The handle was stiff and required several hard pulls before it finally turned with a loud click that echoed through the basement. The door swung open slowly, revealing a small storage room that smelled of old wood and something else, something wild and earthy. Ethan's flashlight swept across the room and then stopped, the beam trembling slightly as it illuminated a small shape huddled in the corner. It was a bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, with dark brown fur that was matted in places and eyes that reflected the light like two golden coins. The cub wasn't moving aggressively or trying to escape. Instead, it was pressed against the wall, shivering, and when it saw them, it made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a plea. Ethan's first instinct was to close the door and call animal control, but Lily had already let go of his hand and taken a step forward, her voice soft and soothing, as she said hello to the frightened creature. The cub's eyes focused on Lily, and something remarkable happened. It stopped shivering and tilted its head slightly, as if recognizing something in her voice or her presence that meant safety. Ethan wanted to pull his daughter back, every parental alarm bell ringing in his head, but he also saw something in that moment that made him pause. The cub wasn't acting like a wild animal. It was acting like a lost child, scared and alone and desperately in need of help. Lily took another small step forward, moving so slowly that it was almost like watching a flower bloom in slow motion. And she held out her small hand, palm up, the universal gesture of peace and friendship. The cub sniffed the air, its little black nose twitching, and then, incredibly, it took a tentative step toward her. Ethan watched in amazement as his daughter and the bear cub seemed to communicate without words, just through gentle movements and soft sounds. Lily sat down cross-legged on the dusty floor, making herself smaller and less threatening, and the cub, after several long moments of consideration, walked over to her and gently pressed its head against her knee. It was such a tender moment that Ethan found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sudden movement or sound might break whatever spell had been cast. The cub was definitely young, probably only a few months old, and it was clear from its condition that it had been trapped in this room for at least a day or two. There were scratch marks all around the door frame from where it had tried to escape, and Ethan noticed an overturned bucket in the corner that had probably contained water at some point. Lily was stroking the cub's head now, her small fingers gentle in its fur, and she looked up at her father with eyes that were bright with wonder and concern. She asked what they were going to do, how the baby bear had gotten trapped here, and where its mother was. Ethan didn't have answers to any of those questions, but he knew they couldn't just leave the cub here. He also knew they couldn't keep it. That would be dangerous and illegal. But looking at the way the cub had curled up against Lily's leg, trusting her completely despite being a wild animal, he realized this wasn't going to be a simple situation. He pulled out his phone to call the local wildlife service, but there was no signal down in the basement, and when he tried to move toward the stairs to get better reception, the cub made a distressed sound and tried to follow Lily, who had started to stand up with her father. That's when they noticed something else strange. Around the cub's neck was a collar, not a typical pet collar, but something that looked handmade from leather, old and worn, but definitely placed there deliberately. Attached to the collar was a small metal cylinder, no bigger than a tube of lipstick, and when Ethan carefully removed it and unscrewed the cap, a rolled piece of paper fell out. The paper was yellowed with age, and the writing on it was faded, but they could make out enough words to understand it was some kind of message or note. It mentioned something about a sanctuary, coordinates that meant nothing to Ethan without a map, and at the bottom, a date from 43 years ago. The mystery of how this cub ended up in their basement was deepening, and Ethan had the strange feeling that finding this bear was not an accident. They decided to bring the cub upstairs, where it was warmer, and where Ethan could get phone signal to call for help. The journey up the narrow stairs was slow and careful. with Lily leading the way and the cub following her as if they had known each other forever. Once in the main room of the lodge, the cub seemed even smaller and more vulnerable, its dark fur contrasting sharply with the warm wooden interior. Ethan finally got through to the wildlife service, but they said the storm was too severe for them to come out tonight. They would have to wait until morning at the earliest. This meant they would be spending the night with a bear cub, something Ethan never could have imagined when they had planned this quiet winter getaway. Lily had already decided the cub needed a name, even if it was just for one night, and she called it Coco because of its brown fur and the way it had curled up near the fireplace like a cup of hot chocolate warming by the fire. Ethan found some canned milk in the kitchen and warmed it up. Not sure if bear cubs could drink cow's milk, but figuring it was better than letting it go hungry. Coco lapped it up eagerly, then returned to Lily's side, seeming to have decided she was its protector now. As the evening wore on, Ethan noticed the cub would occasionally do something unusual, like pawing at specific spots on the floor or sniffing intently at certain walls, almost like it was following a trail only it could sense. Around 9 o'clock, when the wind outside had picked up to an almost howling intensity, Coco suddenly stood up and walked over to an old bookshelf in the corner of the room. The cub pawed at one particular section, making soft, urgent sounds, and when Ethan went to investigate, he found that one of the books was actually a hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwritten entries dating back decades. The first entry that caught his eye mentioned bears, specifically about a family of them that had lived in these mountains for generations. Bears that were different from others, special in ways the writer couldn't fully explain. The journal belonged to someone named Samuel Hayes, and as Ethan read more, he realized this person had been studying these bears, protecting them, and the coordinates in the message from Coco's collar matched a location Samuel had marked as critically important. Lily was sitting on the floor with Coco's head in her lap, humming softly, when Ethan showed her the journal. Even though she couldn't read all the complex words, she understood the pictures Samuel had drawn, beautiful sketches of bears in various poses, and in some of them, the bears seemed to be surrounded by a soft glow, like they were magical or blessed somehow. One particular drawing showed a mother bear with a cub that looked remarkably like Coco, and beneath it was written, "They always return to the Starfall Grove when the winter storms are strongest." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature as he realized that maybe Coco hadn't gotten lost and trapped by accident. Maybe it had been trying to get somewhere specific, and the lodge had been on its path. The journal revealed more secrets as they read through it by firelight, with Coco occasionally making soft sounds as if commenting on certain passages. Samuel Hayes had discovered that these particular bears had an ancient connection to the land, that they were guardians of something he called the winter's heart, though he never fully explained what that meant. He wrote about how the bears would appear to certain people at specific times, usually children, and that these meetings were never random but part of some greater pattern he was still trying to understand. The most recent entry was dated just a week ago, which was impossible since the journal looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but there it was in fresh ink. The young one will come during the great storm. The child of summer will guide it home. The circle continues. Ethan felt like he had stepped into a fairy tale. But the weight of the cub sleeping against his daughter's leg was very real, as was the trust in both their eyes when they looked at each other. He made a decision then that surprised even himself. Tomorrow, storm or no storm, they would follow the coordinates in the journal and take Coco to this Starfall Grove. It felt like the right thing to do, the only thing to do, even though part of his rational mind was screaming that this was dangerous and foolish. But sometimes he thought, looking at his daughter's peaceful face as she stroked the sleeping cub. Sometimes the heart knows things the mind cannot understand. The night passed slowly, with the storm rattling the windows and the fire burning lower until it was just glowing embers. Coco slept curled up next to Lily on the couch, and Ethan kept watch, reading more of the journal, and occasionally checking outside to see if the storm was lessening. Around 3 in the morning, something remarkable happened. Coco woke up suddenly, alert but not alarmed, and walked over to the window. The cub stood on its hind legs, front paws against the glass, and made a sound unlike anything Ethan had heard before, almost like singing. In response, from somewhere out in the storm, came an answering call, deep and resonant, that seemed to make the very walls of the lodge vibrate. Lily woke up and joined Coco at the window, and together they stood there, the child and the cub, looking out into the swirling snow as if they could see something Ethan couldn't. The morning came gradually, the storm finally beginning to weaken as pale light filtered through the clouds. Ethan had managed to find an old map of the area in Samuel's journal, and the coordinates led to a place about 3 miles north of the lodge, through dense forest and up a gradual slope. It would be a difficult hike in good weather, and with the fresh snow, it would be even harder. But both Lily and Coco seemed energized by the prospect. Ethan packed supplies, including food, water, blankets, and emergency gear, not knowing what they might find or how long the journey might take. He left a note for the caretaker, though he didn't even try to explain where they were going or why. Some things couldn't be put into words that would make sense. They set out just after breakfast, Coco leading the way with surprising confidence for such a young creature. The cub would occasionally stop and sniff the air or paw at the snow, then adjust their direction slightly, as if following markers only it could detect. Lily walked beside the cub, her small hand occasionally resting on its back for balance, and Ethan followed behind, carrying the supplies and watching for any signs of danger. The forest was silent except for the soft crunch of snow under their feet and the occasional plop of snow falling from overloaded branches. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost sacred, like they were walking through a cathedral made of trees and snow. About an hour into their hike, they came across tracks in the snow, large bear tracks that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. But Coco showed no fear, instead making excited sounds and picking up the pace. The tracks led them off the path Ethan had plotted from the map, taking them through a narrow valley between 2 ridges where the trees grew so thick that barely any snow had reached the ground. It was warmer here, noticeably so, and Ethan could hear water running somewhere nearby, which seemed impossible given the freezing temperatures. Coco was practically running now, and Lily was laughing, trying to keep up, her cheeks red from cold and exertion. They emerged from the valley into a clearing that took Ethan's breath away. It was circular, maybe 50 feet across, and the trees around it formed a perfect ring. But what was truly remarkable was that there was no snow on the ground here. Instead, there was green grass, and in the center of the clearing was a pool of water that steamed gently in the cold air. Around the pool were rocks that seemed to glow with a soft, warm light, and the air itself felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on Ethan's arms stand up. This had to be the Starfall Grove that Samuel had written about, though nothing in his journal had prepared them for how otherworldly it would feel. Coco ran straight to the pool and began making those singing sounds again, louder this time, and within moments they heard an answering call from the forest. A large bear emerged from between the trees, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so big. Ethan instinctively pulled Lily back, but she resisted, pointing at the bear's eyes. They were the same golden color as Coco's, and more than that, they held an intelligence that was unmistakably profound. The bear, which Ethan assumed was Coco's mother, approached slowly, its gaze moving between the cub and the humans who had brought it home. When it reached Coco, it nuzzled the cub gently, then did something that made Ethan's knees weak. It looked directly at them and bowed its massive head in what could only be interpreted as gratitude. But the surprises weren't over. As the mother bear straightened up, the glowing rocks around the pool began to pulse with brighter light, and the air shimmered like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Other bears began to emerge from the forest, 5, then 10, then more, all moving toward the pool with that same impossible grace. They arranged themselves in a circle around the water, and Coco and its mother took a place in the formation. The humming sound began again, but now it was coming from all of them, a harmony that seemed to resonate with something deep in the earth itself. Lily stepped forward before Ethan could stop her, drawn by something she couldn't name, and when she reached the edge of the pool, she knelt down and placed her hand in the warm water. The moment her skin touched the water, images flooded both her and Ethan's minds, not violently but gently, like memories surfacing from a dream. They saw the history of these bears, stretching back centuries, guardians of this sacred place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. They saw Samuel Hayes as a young man, discovering this grove by accident and dedicating his life to protecting its secret. They saw that the bears were not exactly bears at all, but something older, something that had taken this form to survive in a changing world. And they saw why Coco had come to them. Every generation, a young one was sent out during the winter storm to find a human child, to renew the ancient bond that kept the grove hidden and protected. The visions faded, leaving them gasping softly, overwhelmed by what they had experienced. The bears were still humming, but now it sounded like a lullaby, peaceful and comforting. Coco broke from the circle and ran to Lily, pressing against her legs, and she understood that this wasn't goodbye, not really. The connection they had formed would last forever, and she would always be welcome here, a guardian like Samuel before her. The mother bear approached them one more time, and when it breathed on them, its breath was warm and smelled of pine and earth and something indefinably wild. Then, as if by some silent signal, all the bears began to move back toward the trees, disappearing into the forest as quietly as they had come. Coco was the last to go, lingering with Lily for a long moment, their foreheads touching in a gesture that needed no translation. Then the cub followed its family into the forest, pausing once to look back, its golden eyes bright with what looked like joy. Lily waved, tears streaming down her face but smiling wider than Ethan had ever seen her smile. They stood there in the grove for a while longer, feeling the peace of the place settle into their bones, knowing they had been part of something extraordinary. The pool continued to steam. The rocks continued to glow softly, and the grass remained green despite the winter all around them. When they finally made their way back to the lodge, the journey seemed shorter somehow, as if the forest itself was helping them along. They arrived to find the caretaker waiting for them, an old man with knowing eyes who simply nodded when he saw them, as if he understood where they had been without needing to be told. He handed Ethan a cup of hot coffee and Lily a mug of cocoa, the coincidence of the name making her giggle through her remaining tears. That night, as they sat by the fire, Ethan found himself looking through Samuel's journal again, but now the entries made perfect sense. The last page, which had been blank before, now had writing on it, in Lily's young handwriting, though she insisted she hadn't written it. The circle continues, and the heart of winter beats on. They left the lodge 2 days later when the roads were clear. But both of them knew they would be back. Lily would grow up and return every winter, sometimes alone, sometimes with her own children years later. She would become a protector of the grove like Samuel before her, keeping it secret while ensuring it remained safe from a world that might not understand. And sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, she would dream of golden eyes and warm breath, of a small bear cub that had trusted her completely and shown her that magic still existed in the world. The lodge keeper would age and eventually pass on, but not before teaching Lily everything Samuel had taught him, ensuring the knowledge would continue. Years passed, and Lily became a wildlife biologist, dedicating her career to protecting the wilderness areas around the mountains. She never spoke publicly about the grove or the special bears, but her research and conservation efforts created a buffer zone that kept developers and tourists away from the most sensitive areas. She would often think about that night in the lodge, how a scared little cub had changed the entire trajectory of her life, had shown her that there were still mysteries in the world worth protecting. Her father, Ethan, supported her work, never quite sure if what they had experienced was real or some kind of shared dream, but knowing in his heart that it had been the most real thing he had ever encountered. On Lily's 30th birthday, she returned to the grove alone, as she had many times before. But this time was different. Coco was there, fully grown now, magnificent and powerful, but those golden eyes still held the same warmth she remembered. They sat together by the pool, the woman and the bear, comfortable in each other's presence like old friends who didn't need words. As the sun set and the stars began to appear, other bears emerged from the forest, and Lily realized that Coco had become a leader among them, a bridge between their world and the human world. The humming began again, that beautiful harmony that seemed to make the very air vibrate with life, and Lily hummed along, her voice joining theirs in a song older than memory. The grove had one more surprise for her that night. As the moon rose full and bright, the pool began to glow more intensely, and in its depths she saw not reflections but windows into other groves, other sacred places around the world where similar guardians kept watch. She saw children in distant lands having their own encounters with mysterious creatures, forming bonds that would shape their lives and protect ancient secrets. She understood then that she was part of something much larger than just this one grove, this one family of special bears. She was part of a network of guardians that had existed since the beginning of human consciousness, keeping alive the connection between humanity and the wild spirit of the earth. When she finally left the grove that night, Coco walked with her to the edge of the clearing, just as it had done when it was young. They touched foreheads one more time, a gesture that had become their traditional greeting and farewell, and Lily felt a profound sense of peace. She knew she would continue to return, season after season, year after year, until she was old and gray, and she knew that someday another child would find another scared cub and the cycle would begin again. Because that's how magic works in the real world, not with flash and spectacle, but quietly, gently, through connections that transcend species and understanding. The story of Lily and Coco became a legend in the small mountain town, though the details were always fuzzy and changed with each telling. Some said it was about a girl who could talk to animals. Others said it was about bears that were really angels in disguise. But those who knew the truth, the few who had been chosen to be guardians, they kept the real story close to their hearts. They knew that on winter nights when the storm howled and the snow fell thick, somewhere in the mountains, magical bears still gathered at a grove where the grass grew green and the water ran warm, singing their ancient songs and waiting for the next child who would need to find them. Sukku chapters of mentioned part have completed. The second major part of their journey began 3 weeks after their first encounter, when Lily couldn't stop thinking about the grove and begged her father to return to the lodge for a long weekend. Ethan had been expecting this request, had seen how his daughter's eyes would go distant during everyday activities. how she would draw pictures of bears and glowing pools when she should have been doing homework. He understood the pull she was feeling because he felt it too, a gentle but insistent tugging at his consciousness that suggested their story with the grove was far from over. So they packed their bags and made the drive back to the mountains, arriving at the lodge on a Friday evening when the sun was painting the snow-covered peaks orange and pink. The caretaker greeted them like old friends, his weathered face breaking into a knowing smile when he saw them. He had prepared their same room, had even left a thermos of hot cocoa on the table with a note that simply said, "For when you need warmth on your journey." That night, Lily could barely sleep, her excitement making her toss and turn until, finally, around midnight, she heard it again. That same scratching sound that had started everything, but this time it was coming from outside. She woke her father, and together they went to the window, where they saw something that made them both gasp. There, in the snow, illuminated by moonlight, was a pattern of tracks that formed a perfect spiral, leading away from the lodge toward the forest. They bundled up and followed the tracks, Ethan carrying a flashlight though the moon was so bright they hardly needed it. The spiral led them not directly to the grove, but to a different part of the forest, where the trees grew in strange formations, twisted and bent as if they had been shaped by invisible hands. Here they found Coco waiting for them, but the young bear was not alone. With it was an elderly bear, its fur silver with age, moving slowly but with unmistakable dignity. Coco made soft sounds and gestured with its head for them to follow, and they did, trusting completely even though they were being led into unknown territory. The path they took was winding and seemed to double back on itself several times, as if the forest was testing their commitment or perhaps protecting something from those who might stumble upon it accidentally. Finally, they emerged into another clearing, smaller than the Starfall Grove, but no less remarkable. In the center was not a pool, but a tree, ancient and massive, its trunk so wide that 10 people holding hands couldn't wrap around it. The bark was covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when looked at directly, and from somewhere deep within the tree came a sound like a heartbeat, slow and steady and profoundly alive. The elderly bear approached the tree and placed a paw on its bark, and immediately the symbols began to glow with the same soft light they had seen at the grove. Lily felt drawn to do the same, and when she placed her small hand next to the bear's massive paw, the world exploded into sensation and meaning. She saw the history of the forest itself, stretching back to when the mountains were young and the first bears had walked this land. She saw how the tree and the grove were connected, two parts of a larger system that maintained the balance between the seen and unseen worlds, and she saw something that made her gasp. Samuel Hayes wasn't the first human guardian, and she wouldn't be the last. There had been an unbroken chain of protectors stretching back generations, each chosen as a child, each maintaining the secret until passing it on. The vision showed her something else, something that explained why Coco had come to her specifically. Every few generations, the connection between the human and bear guardians needed to be renewed through a special ritual, something that hadn't been done in over 50 years. The elderly bear was the last one who remembered how it was done, and time was running short. If the ritual wasn't completed before the spring equinox, the protection around the grove and the tree would weaken, potentially exposing them to a world that had forgotten how to believe in such things. Lily understood, without being told, that she and Coco were meant to be the new bridge, the pair that would renew the ancient pact. The ritual itself was surprisingly simple but profound. Over the next 3 nights, Lily and Coco would need to visit 7 different sacred sites in the forest, each marked by a standing stone that most hikers assumed were natural formations. At each stone, they would need to leave an offering, not of food or objects, but of memory and promise. Lily would share a cherished memory from her human life, and Coco would share something from the bear's understanding of the forest. These exchanges would weave a new thread in the tapestry of protection that surrounded the sacred spaces. Ethan could accompany them, but couldn't participate directly. This was something only the chosen pair could do. The first night, they visited 3 stones, each journey taking them deeper into parts of the forest that seemed untouched by human presence. At the first stone, Lily shared her memory of the first time she had seen snow, how it had seemed like the sky was giving the earth a soft blanket. The stone glowed briefly, and Coco responded with a sensation rather than a memory, the feeling of denning with its mother for the first time, the absolute safety and warmth of that embrace. At the second stone, Lily offered her memory of learning to read, the moment when the symbols on a page suddenly transformed into meaning. Coco shared the knowledge of finding water by smell, the way moisture in the air told stories about streams and springs. The third stone was the most challenging to reach, perched on a narrow ledge that required careful climbing. Here, Lily shared her memory of her grandmother's death, her first understanding that all things must end. It was painful to revisit, but she understood instinctively that the ritual required truth, not just pleasant memories. Coco's response was powerful. The bear shared the generational memory of the great fire that had swept through the forest decades ago, how the bears had led other animals to safety, how destruction and renewal were part of the same cycle. When they finished at the third stone, both Lily and Coco were exhausted. But there was also a sense of something building, like pressure before a storm. The second night brought unexpected challenges. A late winter storm moved in, making travel difficult and dangerous. But the elderly bear appeared at the lodge and made it clear, through gestures and sounds, that the ritual couldn't be delayed. So they ventured out into the swirling snow, following the elder and Coco through paths that seemed to exist between the trees rather than through them. The fourth stone was in a hollow where the wind couldn't reach. And here, Lily shared her memory of making her first friend at school, the joy of finding someone who understood her without explanation. Coco shared the experience of playing with its siblings, the rough and tumble that taught boundaries and affection simultaneously. The fifth stone stood at the intersection of 2 streams, the water singing different notes that harmonized in an otherworldly way. Lily offered her memory of the first lie she had told and the guilt that had followed, understanding that honesty with oneself was part of the guardian's responsibility. Coco shared something that surprised her. The bear's understanding of human sadness, gathered from years of observing hikers and campers from hidden vantage points, the empathy that transcended species. The exchange at this stone was particularly intense, leaving both of them shaking slightly as if they had touched something electric. The sixth stone was hidden behind a waterfall that shouldn't have been flowing in winter but was, the water warm enough to create a constant mist that froze into fantastic ice formations on the surrounding rocks. Here, Lily shared her deepest fear, the terror of losing her father, of being alone in a world that suddenly seemed too big. Coco's response was immediate and comforting. The bear shared the knowledge that connection transcends physical presence, that the bonds formed between souls continue beyond separation. It was a profound moment that left Lily crying, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. On the third and final night, only 1 stone remained, but the elderly bear indicated it was the most important. This stone stood in a meadow that in summer would be filled with wildflowers, but now was a pristine expanse of snow under a clear, star-filled sky. The aurora borealis chose that moment to appear, green and purple curtains of light dancing across the heavens, and Lily knew this was meant to be. At this final stone, she was supposed to share not a memory but a promise, a commitment to the future. She placed her hand on the cold stone and spoke aloud for the first time during the ritual, promising to protect the sacred spaces, to pass on the knowledge when the time was right, to be a bridge between worlds for as long as she was needed. Coco's response was unlike anything that had come before. The bear stood on its hind legs and placed both paws on the stone, and suddenly Lily could see through Coco's eyes, could feel what it was like to be bear and guardian both. She experienced the forest as a living entity, felt the underground networks of roots and fungi that connected every plant, sensed the movements of every creature from the smallest insect to the largest predator. But more than that, she felt the presence of something vast and ancient that existed in the spaces between things, the consciousness that the bears served and protected. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once, and when the connection ended, she found herself on her knees in the snow, gasping and laughing and crying simultaneously. The elderly bear approached them then, and for the first time, Lily heard it speak, not with words, but directly into her mind. It told her that the ritual was complete, that the protection would hold for another generation at least. But it also warned her that the world was changing faster than ever before, that the wild places were shrinking, and that her role as guardian would be more challenging than any who had come before. It told her about others like her around the world, children who had been chosen by different creatures to maintain different sacred spaces, and that one day she might need to reach out to them to form a network of protection that could withstand the pressures of the modern world. As the aurora continued to dance overhead, all four of them, Ethan included, sat in the meadow and watched the lights. The elderly bear shared stories of the past through images and sensations, tales of guardians who had faced logging companies and developers, who had used law and advocacy rather than magic to protect the sacred spaces. It showed them how Samuel Hayes had worked with indigenous tribes who had their own connections to the land, how the protection was not just magical but practical, involving conservation easements and land trusts and ecological studies that kept the grove and tree hidden in plain sight. The knowledge transfer continued until dawn, when the first rays of sunlight turned the snow-covered peaks gold and rose. The elderly bear stood slowly, its age showing in every movement, and Lily somehow knew this was goodbye. The ancient guardian had passed on what needed to be shared and could now rest. It touched its nose to Coco's, a gesture of blessing and transfer of responsibility, then turned and walked into the forest with a dignity that brought fresh tears to Lily's eyes. They never saw the elder again, but sometimes, in dreams, Lily would feel its presence, approving and proud of how she was carrying on the tradition. The weeks that followed were transformative for both Lily and her father. They returned home with a new understanding of their place in the world, but also with practical responsibilities. Ethan, inspired by what he had witnessed, began researching conservation law, eventually changing careers to become an environmental attorney, specializing in protecting wilderness areas. He never spoke directly about the grove or the bears, but his passionate advocacy for preserving untouched forests came from a deep, personal knowledge of what was at stake. His work would eventually protect thousands of acres around the mountains, creating a buffer zone that would keep the sacred spaces safe for generations. Lily threw herself into learning everything she could about ecology, biology, and environmental science, but also about the histories and stories of indigenous peoples who had lived in harmony with the land for millennia. She discovered that many of their legends contained truths about the special places and creatures, encoded in mythology to preserve the knowledge. She began corresponding with elders from various tribes, and while she never revealed the specifics of her experience, she found that many of them knew anyway, could see it in her eyes or sense it in her dedication. They taught her additional ways to protect and honor the land, rituals and practices that complemented what the bears had shown her. As she grew older, Lily developed an ability to sense when other sacred spaces were in danger. It wasn't anything as dramatic as visions or voices, just a subtle knowing, a disquiet that would grow until she took action. Sometimes this meant organizing protests against development projects. Sometimes it meant working with landowners to establish conservation agreements, and sometimes it meant simply being present in a place, her guardian energy strengthening the natural protections. She became known in environmental circles as someone who had an uncanny ability to identify the most ecologically important areas, though no one could explain how she knew. Coco would appear periodically throughout her life, always when she needed guidance or comfort. As Lily went through the challenges of adolescence, the bear would meet her in dreams, offering the steady presence of a friend who knew her completely. When she went to college, studying environmental science and indigenous studies, Coco would sometimes be waiting for her when she came home for breaks, sitting at the edge of the forest behind her house, just checking in. When she faced her first major challenge as a guardian, a mining company that wanted to explore the mountains near the grove, Coco was there to remind her that she wasn't alone, that the bears and the forest itself would help her find a way. The solution to the mining threat came from an unexpected source. While researching property records, Lily discovered that Samuel Hayes had been more clever than anyone realized. He had established a trust decades ago, one that held mineral rights to key areas around the grove. The trust had been dormant, waiting for the right person to activate it, and the legal documents included a provision that named the Keeper of the Winter Covenant as the beneficiary. With Ethan's legal expertise, they were able to activate the trust and use it to block the mining company's plans. It was a victory that protected not just the grove, but the entire ecosystem around it. Years turned into decades, and Lily's role as guardian evolved with the changing times. She established a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting wilderness areas, using modern technology and ancient wisdom in equal measure. She developed educational programs that taught children about the importance of wild spaces, always watching for the one who might be the next guardian. She wrote books about ecology and conservation that became influential in the environmental movement, though she never wrote about the bears or the grove directly. Instead, she wove the truths she had learned into stories and examples that helped people understand the interconnectedness of all life. When Lily was in her 40s, she met a young boy named Marcus who reminded her of herself at 7. He had that same sense of wonder, that same ability to see beyond the surface of things. She began teaching him about the forest, taking him on hikes where they would accidentally discover interesting phenomena that sparked his curiosity. She didn't force anything, didn't reveal the secret directly, but she prepared him, just as she suspected the caretaker and others had prepared her without her knowing it. When Marcus was 12, he came to her with a story about hearing strange sounds in the forest, and she knew the time was approaching for the next transition. The passing of guardianship was not something that happened all at once. It was a gradual process, like the changing of seasons. Lily began bringing Marcus with her on her visits to the grove, introducing him to Coco, who was now elderly but still magnificent. She watched as a young bear, one of Coco's cubs, began showing interest in Marcus, following him at a distance, testing the connection. She taught Marcus the history not just of the grove but of all the guardians who had come before, helping him understand that he would be part of a tradition that stretched back to the beginning of human consciousness. The most difficult part was helping Marcus understand that being a guardian wasn't just about protecting a magical place. It was about living in a way that honored the connection between all things, about making choices that considered the welfare of the forest and its creatures in every decision. It meant sometimes being lonely, keeping a secret that separated you from others. But it also meant being part of something magnificent, being trusted with one of the world's last true mysteries. Marcus accepted this responsibility with a maturity beyond his years, and Lily knew the grove would be in good hands. As Lily entered her 60s, she began documenting everything she knew, creating a comprehensive record that would be hidden in various places, insurance against the knowledge being lost. She used a combination of traditional methods, writing in journals that would be hidden in the lodge and other safe places, and modern technology, creating encrypted digital archives that could only be accessed by someone who knew the right questions to ask. She included not just facts, but also the feelings, the sense of wonder and responsibility that came with being a guardian, trying to preserve not just information, but wisdom. One winter evening, when the aurora was particularly bright, Lily stood in the Starfall Grove with Coco, Marcus, and the young bear that had chosen him. 4 generations of guardians in one place, a rare and precious moment. The pool glowed brighter than she had ever seen it, and in its depths she saw not the past or future, but the present moment in all its complexity and beauty. She saw the network of protection that surrounded the grove, made up not just of magic but of human dedication, legal protections, scientific understanding, and pure love. She saw how her life's work had strengthened this network, how Marcus would continue to strengthen it in ways she couldn't imagine. Coco, old and gray now, leaned against her leg one last time, and she felt the bear's gratitude and love wash over her like warm water. They had been partners for over 50 years, had protected the grove through challenges that had seemed insurmountable. They had proven that the connection between human and nature wasn't broken, just dormant, waiting for those brave enough to nurture it back to life. As the aurora danced overhead and the pool reflected its light in impossible colors, Lily felt a peace she had never experienced before, a sense of completion that didn't feel like an ending, but like a transformation. The story of the grove continued beyond Lily's active guardianship, as Marcus took up the mantle with his own unique approach. He was a child of the digital age, and he found ways to protect the sacred spaces using technology Lily had never imagined. He created virtual barriers, using social media and mapping applications to subtly direct people away from sensitive areas. He established a network of hidden cameras that allowed him to monitor the grove and tree without constant physical presence, alerting him to any threats. But most importantly, he maintained the heart of what Lily had taught him, the understanding that protection came not from secrecy alone, but from fostering a love of wild places in others. Marcus also discovered something new about the bears and the grove, something that expanded the understanding of what they were protecting. During a particularly intense aurora display, he was able to perceive what he called the breathing, a rhythm that connected not just the grove and the tree, but sacred spaces all over the world. He realized that these places were like organs in a vast body, each serving a function in maintaining the health of the planet's living systems. The bears were not just guardians but interpreters, translating the needs of this greater organism into actions that humans could understand and support. This discovery led to a new phase in the guardianship, one that involved reaching out carefully to other guardians around the world. Through careful networking and trust building, Marcus helped establish a loose confederation of protectors, each maintaining their own sacred spaces, but sharing knowledge and support when needed. They communicated in code, using imagery and metaphor that would seem like poetry or fiction to outsiders, but carried precise meaning for those who knew. This network would prove crucial in the years to come, as climate change and development pressures intensified the threats to wild places everywhere. The bears, too, evolved in their role. As the older generation passed on, the younger bears showed new abilities, or perhaps ancient abilities that were being reawakened. They could influence weather patterns around the grove, creating microclimates that protected the sacred spaces from the worst effects of global warming. They could communicate across vast distances, coordinating with bears in other regions to share information about threats and opportunities. And most remarkably, they began to appear to more humans, not just the chosen guardians, but to others who showed genuine dedication to protecting the natural world. These appearances were subtle, often dismissed as tricks of light or misidentification, but they had an effect. People who encountered the special bears, even briefly, came away changed. They became more active in conservation efforts, more aware of the interconnectedness of life, more willing to make sacrifices for the sake of the planet. It was as if the bears were seeding human consciousness with an ancient understanding, preparing humanity for a shift that was desperately needed. The grove had become not just a protected space, but a source of transformation, radiating influence far beyond its physical boundaries. The relationship between Lily and Marcus continued even after the formal passing of guardianship. She became an elder advisor, someone he could turn to when facing challenges that seemed insurmountable. Their conversations, whether in person or through carefully encrypted communications, were rich with wisdom and strategy. Lily shared stories of past guardians she had learned about through her research, each one offering lessons for the present. She helped Marcus understand that each generation of guardians faced unique challenges that required unique solutions, that tradition was important, but innovation was essential. One of the most significant challenges came when a well-funded research expedition announced plans to comprehensively map and study the mountains where the grove was hidden. The expedition included advanced technology that could detect thermal anomalies and unusual electromagnetic signatures, exactly the kind of things that the grove and tree produced. Marcus and Lily worked together on a solution that was both elegant and effective. They used their network to place allies within the expedition, scientists who were sympathetic to conservation, and who could subtly redirect research away from the most sensitive areas. But they also did something unexpected. They allowed the expedition to discover certain things, carefully chosen anomalies that would satisfy scientific curiosity while protecting the deeper secrets. They let the researchers find unusual plant species that could be explained by unique microclimates. They let them discover cave systems that were interesting but not magical. By giving the expedition enough genuine discoveries to make their work worthwhile, they prevented deeper probing that might have exposed the grove. It was a delicate balance, but it worked, and the published research actually ended up supporting greater protection for the area. Through all of this, the bond between human and bear guardians remained at the heart of the protection. Marcus and his bear partner, whom he had named Aurora after the lights that had presided over their first meeting, developed a connection that was even deeper than what Lily and Coco had shared. They could communicate in what Marcus described as emotional mathematics, complex feelings and concepts transmitted instantly and completely. This enhanced communication allowed them to respond to threats with unprecedented coordination, mobilizing both human and natural resources to protect the sacred spaces. As the years passed, the effects of the Guardians' work became visible in unexpected ways. The forests around the grove remained healthy even as other areas struggled with disease and drought. Wildlife populations that were declining elsewhere thrived in the protected zones. And perhaps most remarkably, people who spent time in these areas reported profound experiences of peace and clarity, as if the land itself was teaching them something important. The grove had become not just a hidden sanctuary but a beacon of hope, proof that humans and nature could not only coexist but enhance each other. Lily lived to see her great-grandchildren born, though they were not biological descendants, but rather the spiritual inheritors of the guardian tradition. She watched as Marcus trained the next generation, passing on not just knowledge but the sense of wonder that made the responsibility a joy rather than a burden. She saw the network of guardians grow stronger, more sophisticated, better able to protect sacred spaces in an increasingly complex world. And she saw the bears evolve into something even more magnificent, bridges between the physical and spiritual realms that helped humanity remember its place in the greater web of life. On her 90th birthday, Lily made one final trip to the grove. She moved slowly now, supported by Marcus and Aurora, but her eyes were as bright as they had been at 7 years old. Coco had passed years ago, but she felt its presence in every tree, every stone, every drop of water in the sacred pool. As she sat by the water's edge, she saw in its depths not her reflection, but the faces of all the guardians who had come before, and all who would come after. She saw the unbroken chain of protection stretching into a future where humanity had remembered how to live in harmony with the earth. As the sun set on that final visit, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to echo the aurora, Lily felt herself becoming part of something larger. Not dying, but transforming, her consciousness merging with the grove itself. She understood then what the elderly bear had tried to tell her so many years ago. Guardians never really leave, they just change form, becoming part of the protection itself. Her body would return to the earth, but her spirit would remain in every rustling leaf, every warm spring, every golden-eyed bear that watched over the sacred spaces. Marcus felt the moment of transition, felt Lily's presence shift from beside him to all around him. Aurora made a sound that was part mourning, part celebration, acknowledging the passing of a great guardian and the strengthening of the grove's protection. They stayed until the stars came out, until the aurora began its nightly dance, and then they walked back through the forest, carrying with them the knowledge that the circle continued, that the story had no end, only transformation. The grove would endure, protected by bonds of love and duty that transcended death, connecting all who had served it in an eternal embrace of purpose and wonder. The legacy of that winter night when a 7-year-old girl heard scratching sounds in a ski lodge basement lived on in ways both seen and unseen. Every child who learned to love nature, every forest that was protected from development, every moment of connection between human and wild was part of that legacy. The bears continued their ancient watch, the grove continued its mysterious work, and somewhere, always, a child was discovering that the world held more magic than they had ever imagined. The story spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in hearts and minds, growing into a forest of understanding that would, in time, cover the earth with protection and love. And in the Starfall Grove, where the water runs warm even in winter and the grass grows green despite the snow, the magic continues. The bears still gather on nights when the aurora dances, their golden eyes reflecting the lights of heaven. They sing their wordless songs that make the very mountains tremble with life. And sometimes, if you know where to look and how to listen, you can feel it too, that ancient rhythm that connects all living things, that reminds us we are never alone, never separate, always part of something infinitely beautiful and worth protecting. The grove waits, patient and eternal, for the next child who will hear its call, who will take up the guardian's mantle and continue the story that has no end, only endless, beautiful beginnings. In the quietest moments of winter when snow falls soft and thick, muffling all sound except the beating of your own heart, you might understand what Lily discovered that night so long ago. Magic isn't something separate from the world, something that exists only in stories and dreams. It's woven into the very fabric of reality. Waiting in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moment when a child's hand touches wild fur and finds not fear, but friendship. It lives in the courage to protect what others might not understand, in the wisdom to keep secrets that preserve wonder, in the love that connects us to all living things. The bears know this, have always known it, and through guardians like Lily and Marcus and all who came before and will come after, they share this knowledge with humanity, one precious soul at a time. The circle continues, unbroken and eternal, a promise written in paw prints and footprints across the snow, in the steam rising from sacred waters, in the golden eyes that watch from the shadows with patient, endless love. And somewhere, right now, in this very moment, a child is taking their first step toward discovering that they, too, are part of this ancient story, this dance between human and nature that has been going on since the world began. The bears are waiting for them. The grove is calling to them, and the magic that Lily found in that equipment room lives on, as fresh and powerful as morning snow, as eternal as the mountains themselves, as real as the love between a little girl and a bear cub who needed each other more than either could have known.